Pauline Douglas stood in Nolan Rawlins' doorway, with rain dripping from her bonnet, one hand on a skillet and the other hiding the bruise from the family who had sent her away. "I can make dinner if the Lord lets me stay," she warned, as if kindness came with a bill. Mercy Creek had laughed over her empty purse, ruined name, and the train ticket no one would buy. Nolan had 2 cold rooms, one lonely table, and a silence that had punished him for years. He thought he was offering shelter, not knowing her supper would unlock the gentle home neither had dared pray for. Before the story begins, tell me where you are listening from tonight. Leave your country in the comments. And if you believe wounded hearts, quiet cowboys, and forgotten women can still find redemption, subscribe for the next Western romance. By the time Pauline Douglas reached the general store, the hem of her brown dress was dark with mud, and the whole town seemed to know she had nowhere to sleep. Mercy Creek was the sort of place where a woman's trouble could travel faster than a rider changing horses. One whisper from the church steps became a question at the blacksmith's shed. One closed door at a family house became a joke by the Cracker Barrel before noon. Pauline had not been gone from her sister's porch an hour before. Folks began looking at her with that careful, hungry curiosity people save for misfortune. She stood in front of the flour sacks with 2 nickels in her palm, not enough for flour, beans, salt pork, or even a paper twist of coffee. Her fingers curled around the coins until the edges bit her skin. Mort Keene, who owned the store and acted as if he owned every person who owed him money, leaned both hands on the counter. "Credit's close to you, Miss Douglas." Pauline lifted her chin. "I did not ask for credit. You stood long enough near my flour to make me nervous." A laugh went up from the 3 men sitting by the stove. It was not loud at first. It was worse than loud. It was comfortable, as if laughing at a hungry woman had been done there many times and never once troubled any conscience. Pauline turned toward the door, but Mort was not finished. "Your brother-in-law came by, said you left his household owing board, laundry, and a Christian apology. My sister's husband can say what suits him. He said you were offered a respectable arrangement and refused it." Pauline's face warmed. She looked at the floorboards, where sawdust had been scattered to catch mud and tobacco spit. The respectable arrangement had been Asa Voss, a widower twice her age with 3 spoiled boys, a tobacco-stained beard, and hands that always seemed to close around a woman's arm before he spoke to her. Silas Bell, Pauline's brother-in-law, owed Asa money. Pauline had learned that part by accident, standing outside the parlor door, while the men thought she was washing linens in the yard. A marriage would settle it, Silas had said. A woman past 25 should be grateful, Asa had answered. Pauline had refused before breakfast. By sunrise, Silas had gripped her arm hard enough to leave marks and shoved her valise onto the porch. Her sister, Eliza, stood behind him with red eyes and said nothing. That silence had hurt worse than the bruise. "I will pay for what I need when I have work," Pauline said. Mort gave her a slow look from bonnet to boots. "Work from who?" Another laugh. This one came quicker. Pauline walked out before tears could make her cheap. The rain had slackened to a cold mist. Across the street, the church bell hung gray and still. She had sat beneath it every Sunday for 8 months, wearing a mended hat and singing hymns beside women who now watched from windows without opening their doors. At the station, Mr. Cady, the ticket agent, would not meet her eye. Silas said there might be a ticket waiting, Pauline said. Mr. Cady shuffled papers that did not need shuffling. No ticket came. "He told me I was to go to Abilene." "Then he told you wrong. There were 2 benches in the station, both empty." Pauline sat on the edge of one and placed her valise between her feet. It held one spare dress, her mother's Bible, a tin of buttons, and a rolled apron with a torn corner. She had once had more: a cedar chest, a quilt, a little blue pitcher her mother bought from a peddler when Pauline was 12. But after her parents died, everything worth keeping had been divided by people with houses to put things in. A freight train came through at midday, and left without her. By late afternoon, hunger was a hollow ache under her ribs. Pride kept her sitting straight, but pride had no warmth in it. When the station closed, Mr. Cady cleared his throat. "Miss Douglas, I can't have you sleeping here." "I understand." He looked ashamed, but not ashamed enough to help. Pauline stepped back into the street. The rain began again, thin at first, then steady. She walked because standing still would make her tremble. At the edge of town, where the road split toward the Rollins place and the old cemetery, she nearly turned toward the graves, not to do herself harm. She was not that far gone. But the cemetery had a low stone wall, and a woman might sit beside her parents' names until morning if she had nowhere else. Then she saw the skillet. It lay half buried in weeds near the ditch, black iron with a cracked wooden handle. She recognized it from the church supper last spring. Nolan Rollins had brought it filled with fried potatoes and onions, then left before the meal was served. Someone must have borrowed it, lost it, or tossed it from a wagon. Pauline picked it up and wiped mud from the rim with her sleeve. She knew Nolan Rollins only by sight. Everyone knew him by sight. A tall, quiet rancher in a black hat, with a scar running pale through one eyebrow, and a way of standing apart, even when he was among people. He came to town for feed, nails, and coffee. He paid cash. He spoke little. Children stared at him, and women lowered their voices when he passed, not because he had ever harmed anyone, but because loneliness on a man could look dangerous to those who did not care to understand it. His ranch was 3 miles out. Pauline told herself she would return the skillet. That was all. A decent errand, a reason to knock. Perhaps he would point her toward a barn. Perhaps he would say no, and she would keep walking. The road to the Rollins place climbed through wet grass and mesquite, past a broken windmill and a line of cottonwoods bent by years of hard weather. By the time Pauline saw the house, dusk had settled blue across the land. It was not a grand ranch house, just a squared-off place of weathered boards, with a porch that sagged slightly at one end and a barn beyond it. Smoke rose thin from the chimney. A lamp burned in one window. Pauline stood in the yard until the smell reached her. Beans, my bay, burned at the bottom. Her stomach clenched. She climbed the porch steps and knocked before fear could stop her. The door opened. Nolan Rollins filled the frame, one hand resting on the jamb, his black shirt open at the throat, his face shadowed by lamplight. His eyes went first to her soaked bonnet, then to the skillet, then to the hand she kept tucked beneath her shawl. "Miss Douglas." She had not expected him to know her name. "I found your skillet." He looked at it. "Lost that months ago. I cleaned what I could." The smell of scorched beans thickened behind him. Somewhere inside, a child coughed. Pauline blinked. "You have children here?" "My sisters, too. Only for a spell." Another cough, smaller this time. Then a girl's voice said, "Uncle Nolan, supper's black again." A flush moved across Nolan's cheekbones. It would have been funny in another life. Pauline's fingers tightened on the skillet. She was wet, hungry, humiliated, and afraid. But she knew a burned supper when she smelled one. And she knew children should not go to bed with only smoke in their mouths. "I can make dinner," she said, her voice rough from walking and swallowing tears. "If the Lord lets me stay." Nolan did not answer at once. Rain ticked off the porch roof between them. Pauline braced herself for pity, suspicion, or the dull closing of another door. Instead, Nolan stepped back. "Come in, Miss Douglas." The warmth inside the Rollins house made Pauline's knees weaken. Not comfort, not yet. The room was too bare for that. A table with 3 mismatched chairs, a stone hearth, a row of hooks by the door, a shelf with tin plates, a coffee pot, and one cracked mug turned upside down. The floor had been swept, but no woman's hand had softened the place in years. There were no curtains, no rag rug, no jar of flowers, nothing set down for beauty. 2 children stood near the hearth like small prisoners awaiting sentence. The boy was 8 or 9, thin as a rail, with Nolan's dark eyes and a cowlick no comb could conquer. The girl was maybe 6, wrapped in a blanket, her pale hair braided crookedly. "This is Toby," Nolan said. "And Ruth?" Pauline nodded to them. "I'm Pauline Douglas." Ruth stared at her dripping skirts. "Are you a cook?" "No," Pauline said, then looked toward the blackened pot hanging over the fire. "But I know when beans have surrendered." Toby's mouth twitched. Nolan looked as if he did not know whether he was allowed to smile. Pauline set the skillet on the table and removed her bonnet. Her hair had come loose from its pins. She tucked it back without fuss. "Do you have cornmeal?" Nolan pointed to a sack near the shelf. "Onion, cellar, milk, cow went dry, lard, a little, eggs. The hens are better Christians than me. They give something most mornings." Pauline looked at him then, and this time the smile came to both of them, small and startled. "Fetch me what you have," she said. Nolan moved at once. That was the first thing Pauline noticed. He did not stand over her like a man testing a servant. He did not bark orders or apologize too much. He brought the onion, cornmeal, lard, salt, and 3 eggs in a chip bowl. Then he took the ruined beans outside without being asked, though the pot smoked like judgment. Pauline washed her hands in a basin. The water turned gray with road dust. She found a knife, cut the onion thin, mixed cornmeal with water and 1 egg, and set the skillet over the fire. When the lard melted, the onion hissed sharp and sweet. Ruth stepped closer. "That smells better. Most things do when they are not burned," Pauline said. Toby washed her hands. "Uncle Nolan burns coffee too." Nolan had just stepped back inside. "Boy, it's true." Pauline kept her eyes on the skillet, but warmth rose in her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. Not happiness. Not yet, but something near it. A room could change when people expected supper instead of disappointment. She made corn cakes browned at the edges, fried onion, and eggs stretched thin, so every plate held some. It was not a feast. It would not have filled a harvest crew. But when she set the plates down, Ruth folded her hands without being told. "Bless us, O Lord," the child whispered, then glanced at Pauline. "And bless the lady who made it not black." Toby snorted. Nolan bowed his head, but his mouth pulled tight, as if he were holding back more than laughter. Pauline ate last and least. Nolan noticed. He pushed half a corn cake from his plate toward hers. She stopped him with a look. "I am not begging. I didn't say you were. You were about to feed me like a stray." "No." His voice stayed low. "I was about to pay the cook." She wanted to refuse. Pride stood up inside her, thin but stubborn. Then Ruth yawned over her plate, and Toby scraped onion from the skillet with the hunger of a boy who had learned not to waste. Pauline took the half-corn cake. "Then I accept wages." After supper, she washed dishes while Nolan took the children to the loft. Pauline heard the murmur of his voice above, awkward and gentle, telling them to mind the blanket and not kick each other. Ruth asked if the lady would still be there in the morning. Nolan did not answer quickly enough. Pauline scrubbed the skillet harder. When he came down, she had the kitchen put right. Her wet dress had dried in stiff patches. The bruise on her wrist had darkened purple. Nolan saw it. His jaw changed. "Who did that?" "No one you need trouble yourself over." "That wasn't what I asked." She dried the last plate and set it on the shelf. A door closed too hard. "Doors don't leave fingerprints." Pauline pulled her sleeve down. "Men do. So do rumors. Both bruise if they are handled long enough." Nolan stood very still. The firelight made one side of his face gold and left the other side in shadow. "You can sleep in the back room," he said. "It has a bolt on the inside." "I can sleep in the barn." "You can sleep in the back room." "I have no money." "You made supper." "That was one meal." "Then make breakfast." His answer was so plain that tears nearly rose again. Pauline turned toward the window, where rain blurred the dark yard. "Mercy Creek will talk." Mercy Creek talks when a rooster dies. They will say, I am not fit to be here. Nolan walked to the shelf and took down the cracked mug. He poured coffee from the pot, sniffed it, made a face, and set it aside. I've heard what they say about me for 10 years. And does it not matter? It matters. He looked at her then, but not enough to let children eat burned beans or a woman sleep in the rain. She had no answer to that. The back room held a narrow bed, a trunk, and a window facing the barn. Nolan brought a quilt and a towel. He set them on the trunk, then backed out, without crossing the threshold. The bolt works, he said. Pauline touched the edge of the quilt. Mr. Rollins, Nolan is fine. She could not call him that yet. It felt too soft, too close. Why did you open the door? His eyes went to the skillet in her hand. Because you knocked. He closed the door. Pauline slid the bolt into place and stood in the quiet room, trembling so hard she had to sit down. She had slept in houses where she was kin and felt unsafe. Now she sat in a stranger's spare room with a working bolt, and for the first time that day she could breathe. In the morning, the rain had stopped, leaving the world washed and silver. Pauline rose before dawn. She found flour in the cellar, bacon rind wrapped in cloth, potatoes sprouting eyes, and coffee that looked strong enough to shoe a mule. By the time Nolan came in from milking, the house smelled of fried potatoes and biscuits. He stopped in the doorway. Toby and Ruth came down the ladder half-dressed, hair wild, faces sleepy. Ruth whispered, "It smells like Sunday." Pauline looked away quickly. Nolan washed at the basin. He did not speak until they were seated. "I have to go into town for feet." Pauline's hand still. "I'll tell Mort Keene you're working here," he said. "Paid work, cooking and keeping house while the children are with me. I did not ask you to speak for me." "No," he said. "You asked the Lord to let you stay." Her eyes met his. He added, quieter, "I reckon the Lord can use a witness." By the third day, Pauline knew the Rollins house by sound. The pump handle squealed before water came. The hearth popped when mesquite burned too hot. The west window rattled even when there was no wind. Toby dragged his left heel when he was tired, and Ruth hummed hymns under her breath while pretending not to be afraid of the dark. Nolan came and went with the rhythm of ranch work. Before sunrise, he was in the barn. By breakfast, he smelled of hay, horse, leather, and cold air. At noon, he might ride in for a meal or send Toby with a bucket of eggs from the henhouse. At night, he washed quietly, ate what Pauline set before him, and listened more than he talked. That listening unsettled her. Most men she had known filled a room with their knees. Her father had been kind, but even he expected women to know what needed doing without being tanked. Silas filled his house with complaint. Asa Voss filled any silence with his own importance. Nolan did not ask Pauline to hurry. He did not correct how she folded towels. He did not tell her she used too much salt or too little. When she moved the flour barrel away from a damp wall, he noticed the next morning and set 2 bricks beneath it so mice would have a harder time. That was how trust came, not in speeches, in bricks beneath a flour barrel. Pauline had always been useful. Useful was safe. A useful woman might be kept, if not cherished. So she worked as if the house might throw her out if she paused too long. She scrubbed soot from the stove. She washed curtains that did not exist by cutting old feed sacks, boiling them, and stitching simple panels for the front window. She patched Toby's trousers and let the seams out in Ruth's dress. She turned a heel on Nolan's sock and left it folded by his chair without comment. The next day, he left a silver dollar beside the sugar tin. Pauline found it after breakfast. She took it to the barn. Nolan was tightening a cinch on a dun gelding. He saw the coin in her hand and sighed before she spoke. "It is too much," she said. "It is wages. For 4 days. For 4 days. 3 meals a day. Washing, sewing, and making my niece smile for the first time since her mother died." Pauline looked toward the corral fence. Ruth sat there with Toby, both of them feeding grass to a patient old mule. "I did not know." Nolan's hands slowed on the leather. My sister Clara died last winter. Fever. Her husband followed in spring. The children stayed with Widow Hale, but she took sick. They came here 2 weeks ago, and you were burning beans. I was doing worse before beans. Pauline glanced at him. He took off his hat and ran one hand through his dark hair. Without the hat, he looked younger and more tired. I can keep cattle alive. Children are a different breed. They need steadiness more than fine words. I am short on both. You are not short on steadiness. He looked at her then, surprised enough that she nearly regretted speaking. Pauline pressed the coin into his hand. Pay me what is fair, Mr. Rollins, not what guilt chooses. His fingers closed around the dollar, not touching her. Nolan. She looked down. He said it again, not demanding. Nolan. The morning air moved between them, cool and clean. Pay me what is fair, Nolan, she said. His name felt dangerous and gentle both. That afternoon, he took her to town. Pauline did not want to go, but sugar, lamp oil, and calico did not walk out to Ranches by Mercy. She sat beside Nolan on the wagon bench, her gloved hands folded tight, while Toby and Ruth rode in the back with feed sacks. As Mercy Creek came into view, Pauline's stomach turned hard. Nolan seemed to know. You don't have to look small, he said. I feel small. Feeling ain't a command. That was the sort of thing he said. Plain words that stayed. At the store, conversation stopped when they entered. Mort Keene stood behind the counter with the same smile he had worn when he refused her flour. Well now, he said. Miss Douglas. Nolan removed his hat. Mrs. Keene around. Mort blinked. In the back. Good. Pauline needs cloth. Ruth needs ribbon. Toby needs boots if you've got a pair not made of paper. Put it on my account. Mort's eyes moved between them. Your account? My account. A man near the stove muttered. Housekeeper, is she? Nolan turned his head slowly. The man looked into his coffee. Pauline felt every eye in the store. She wanted to disappear. Instead, she walked to the bolts of calico and chose the plainest dark blue. Her hands shook only once. Mrs. Keene came out and looked at Pauline with something softer than pity. That blue will wash well, she said. Yes, ma'am. For curtains. For a dress, eventually. Then you need thread that won't shame the cloth. Mrs. Keene brought thread, ribbon, and a paper of needles. She wrapped them with care. At the counter, Mort cleared his throat. There is still the matter of Miss Douglas's previous balance. Pauline stiffened. I have no balance here. Mort reached beneath the counter and produced a ledger signed under Silas Bell's household. Flour, coffee, lamp oil, 2 jars muslin, patent tonic, and a rail ticket ordered but not paid. Name listed, Pauline Douglas. The store went quiet in a new way. Pauline's face strained. I never signed for those things. Mort tapped the page. Mark's here. Nolan leaned over the ledger. That and her hand. Mort snorted. You know her hand. Nolan's eyes lifted. I know a forced line when I see one. Pauline could barely breathe. The rail ticket. Silas had ordered it under her name, never paid, then used the debt to make her look dishonest. Or Asa had. Or both. The room felt hot. Nolan closed the ledger with one finger. No more talk of that until it's settled proper. Mort's mouth tightened. Date is debt, fraud ain't. Pauline looked at Nolan. His voice had not risen, but the store seemed to draw back from him. Outside, she climbed into the wagon without help. Pride demanded that much. The children scrambled in after her. Nolan loaded feed in silence, paid for what he had bought, and drove out of town. They were a mile down the road before Pauline spoke. I did not make that mark. No. You cannot know. I can enough. She stared straight ahead. I will not have you paying debts made to shame me. I didn't offer. You looked like you might. I looked mad. That startled a laugh out of her. It broke from some cracked place inside. Nolan glanced over, and for a moment his hard face softened so completely that she looked away. At the ranch, life resumed, but something had changed. Not between Pauline and the work, between Pauline and herself. She wrote her name that evening on a scrap of brown paper, over and over, until the lines steadied. Pauline Douglas, Pauline Douglas, Pauline Douglas. Ruth watched from across the table. Why are you writing so much? So no one forgets how my name looks when I write it. Toby leaned close. Can you teach me my? Pauline looked at Nolan, who stood by the hearth. He nodded. So she wrote Tobias Rollins in careful letters and set the pencil in the boy's hand. Then Ruth wanted hers. Then Nolan, after a long while, took a seat and pushed a scrap toward Pauline. I never had much schooling, he said. The confession was quiet, costly. Pauline did not smile. She wrote his name at the top, Nolan Rollins. He studied it like it was a gate he had never known how to open. Your turn, she said. His first letters were rough. The N leaned, and the R looked wounded, but he wrote it. That night, after the children were asleep, Pauline set the papers on the mantel to dry. 4 names in pencil. 4 people under one roof, each claiming space. The rumor came to the ranch tied to a sack of oats. It was delivered by Jed Harlan, a young hand who worked now and then for Nolan and carried gossip because he had not yet learned the price of it. He rode in after supper, hat dripping with the first hard rain of a 3-day storm, and stood on the porch with his boots leaving dark half-moons on the boards. Towns rile, Jed said. Nolan took the oats from him. Towns often rile. This time it's over, Miss Douglas. Pauline stood just inside the door, Ruth's mending in her lap. She did not move. Jed saw her and swallowed. Beg pardon, ma'am. Say it, Pauline said. Jed looked at Nolan. Nolan's face was still. She asked. Jed twisted his hat. Silas Bell says Miss Douglas stole money from his house before leaving. Says she ran because Asa Voss meant to have the sheriff ask questions. The needle in Pauline's hand pricked her tongue. Blood welled bright. That is a lie. Jed nodded too fast. Yes, ma'am. I'm only saying what they're saying. What else? Nolan asked. Jed wished he had never ridden over. It was plain in his face. Reverend Pike's calling a meeting after Sunday service. Silas says he has proof she's unfit to work in any decent home. Asa says he can settle the whole matter if Miss Douglas agrees to marry him and let the debt be folded proper. Nolan set the oats down slowly. Pauline stood. The room tilted, but she would not reach for the chair. There it is, she whispered. The men looked at her. She pressed the cloth against her tongue. Silas owes Asa. Asa wants a servant he can call wife. Mort wants his ledger settled. My sister wants peace badly enough to sell me into it. Nolan's voice was dangerous in its softness. Did Asa touch you? No. Did Silas? She looked at her wrist. Jed muttered something that might have been a curse and backed toward his horse. After he rode away, the storm closed around the house. Rain hit the roof hard. The children had gone quiet in the loft. Nolan barred the door. Pauline laughed once, without humor. A barred door will not stop a town. It might stop a fool. She went to the sink and washed the blood from her tongue. You should send me away before Sunday. No, you have the children. I know. You have a name in this county. His mouth twisted. Depending who says it. You have land, cattle, an account at the store. I have one dress and a lie following me like a dog. You have more than that. She turned on him. Do I? Because every house I have entered found a use for me until keeping me became costly. My parents died and my brothers sold the farm. My sister took me in because I could cook, wash, mend, and mind her children. Then her husband found a way to trade me for debt. Now I stand in your kitchen with your flour on my hands, and the whole town says that makes me yours to defend or discard. The words came harsher than she meant. They shook when they left her. Nolan took them without flinching. You and my to discard. That broke something in her. She sat at the table and covered her face. For a while, the only sound was rain. Then Nolan sat across from her, not beside, not too close. My father ruled this house with a belt and a Bible, he said. Pauline lowered her hands. He looked at the table as if the grain in the wood held a map of old sorrow. He could quote scripture while making my mother cry. If supper was late, he threw the plate. If coffee was weak, he called her useless. If I stood between them, he said I had the devil's temper. Pauline forgot her own fear for a moment. Nolan, I grew big enough to stop him. One night I did. I broke his jaw. Folks said I was just like him then. His eyes lifted, dark and full of an old shame. My mother died, believing peace meant keeping quiet. After she was gone, I kept this house cold. Thought if nobody needed me, I couldn't hurt them. The rain hammered harder. Pauline understood then why the rooms had been bare, why Nolan stepped back from thresholds, why he never entered the back room without permission, why he used plain words like boards laid carefully over a bad crossing. You are not him, she said. I know that some days. And other days I hear his voice come out of men in town, and I want to answer with my fists. She looked at his hands, broad and scarred, resting open on the table. Hands that had carried water, set bricks under flour, paid wages instead of charity, and backed away from a woman's door. You answer by not being him, she said. He closed his eyes briefly. The storm kept them in 3 days. By the second day, the creek rose and the road washed out. Nolan worked in rain to brace the barn door. Pauline kept water boiling, socks dry, children busy, and the fire alive. Toby grew feverish from damp and fear. Ruth cried at night for her mother. Pauline sat between their beds in the loft and told them stories her own mother had told her, about women crossing plains with seas sewn into hems and men learning gentleness too late, but not always too late. Nolan listened from below, unseen. On the third night, the storm slackened. Toby's fever broke. Pauline came down the ladder near midnight, exhausted. Nolan stood at the table with a lantern, looking at something spread before him. What is that? She asked. My mother's recipe book. The cover was cracked leather, tied with string. Inside, the pages were covered in a woman's faded hand. Pauline touched the edge, but did not open it further. I found it in the trunk, Nolan said. I hadn't looked at it since she died. Why now? He took a breath. Because when you cook in this house, I don't hear him. Pauline's throat tightened. He pushed the book toward her. Would you use it? It was not a proposal, not a confession, not a promise spoken too soon. It was trust. Pauline accepted the book with both hands. I will keep it clean, she said. I don't care if it gets flour on it. She looked up. His face was solemn, but his eyes were warm. A recipe book ought to know flour. The next morning, she made his mother's molasses biscuits. The house filled with a sweetness Nolan had not smelled since childhood. He stepped inside, took one breath, and gripped the back of a chair. Pauline pretended not to see, but Ruth saw. She slipped her hand into Nolan's and leaned against his side. Nolan did not move away. Sunday came bright after the storm, as if the sky had washed itself clean, just to watch Mercy Creek make a choice. Pauline dressed in the dark blue calico she had sewn by lamplight. The seams were plain, the collar modest, the cuffs made from the best parts of her old brown dress. She pinned her hair carefully and tied her bonnet with steady fingers. Nolan hitched the wagon without asking whether she meant to go. The children climbed in wearing scrubbed faces and solemn eyes. Toby carried the scraps of paper where he, Ruth, Nolan, and Pauline had practiced their names. Ruth carried one of the molasses biscuits wrapped in a cloth, because, she said, truth here's better with breakfast. Pauline almost smiled. At the church, wagons filled the yard. People turned as Nolan pulled in. Conversation thinned, then sharpened in whispers. Silas Bell stood near the steps in his Sunday coat, looking important and injured. Eliza stood beside him, pale and thin. Her hands knotted in front of her. Asa Voss waited near the hitching rail with his thumbs hooked in his vest and possession already sitting in his eyes. Pauline's stomach rolled. Nolan came around to help her down. She looked at his offered hand. If she took it, they would call it proof. If she refused it, fear would choose for her. Pauline placed her gloved hand in his and stepped down in front of the whole town. A whisper moved like wind through dry grass. Nolan released her at once, but something had already been said without words. Inside, Reverend Pike preached from the book of James about the tongue being a small fire. It was a brave sermon for a man who had let gossip warm his own church steps all week. Pauline listened without bitterness because bitterness would tire her, and she needed all her strength. After the final hymn, Reverend Pike remained at the pulpit. "There's a matter troubling this congregation and town," he began. Nolan's jaw set. Pauline stood before he could. Every head turned. Her knees trembled beneath her skirt, but her voice held. "If the matter is me, Reverend, I would rather stand where folks can see my face." The church went still. Reverend Pike looked startled, then nodded. "Come forward, Miss Douglas." She walked down the aisle alone, not because Nolan would not have walked with her, because she needed to know she could. At the front, she turned. Silas rose at once. "My wife's sister has brought shame to our household. We showed Christian patience. She repaid us with defiance, theft, and a willingness to live under a bachelor's roof." Several women lowered their eyes. A few men looked at Nolan. Pauline folded her hands so no one would see them shake. Silas continued, "Asa Voss, being a merciful man, has offered to marry her and settle the debts she has made." Asa stood, smiling. "I don't hold a woman's mistakes against her if she learns obedience." Nolan took one step. Pauline glanced at him. Just once. He stopped. That was his risk. Not fighting. Not rescuing her by force. Letting her speak when every instinct in him wanted to stand between. Pauline faced Asa. "I will not marry you." Asa's smile soured. "You might not have many offers after today." "I would rather have no offers than be bought with a lie," Silas barked. "Mind yourself." Pauline turned to him. "I minded you for 8 months. I cooked your meals, washed your shirts, nursed your children, and listened while you told my sister I should be grateful for a corner bed. I minded you until you put your hand on me and told me I would marry your creditor." A murmur broke. Eliza covered her mouth. Silas' face flushed dark. "That is a wicked falsehood." Pauline reached into her reticule and withdrew the scraps from the Rollins table. "Mort Keene's ledger says my name was marked for debts I did not make. I could not prove the mark false, while folks believed I was too ignorant or too desperate to be heard. So I brought handwriting." Toby stood on the pew beside Nolan. "I wrote mine too." A nervous ripple passed through the church. Pauline laid the papers on the communion table. "This is my hand. This is the hand of a child learning. This is Mr. Rollins' hand, also learning." None matched the mark in the store ledger. Mort Keene, seated halfway back, shifted in discomfort. Reverend Pike looked at him. "Did you bring the ledger as asked?" Mort swallowed. "I did." He came forward and opened it. Pauline saw the false mark again, a crooked P, a heavy drag where the pen had paused. Mrs. Keene rose from her pew. "That mark was made the day Mr. Bell came for tonic and cloth. Miss Douglas was not with him. I told Mort so." Mort glared at his wife, but she did not sit down. Reverend Pike looked toward Silas. "Mr. Bell." Silas threw up his hands. "A man buys for his household. What difference whose name?" "The difference," Nolan said from the pew, voice low but carrying, "is you put debt on a woman you meant to force." Asa snapped. "Careful, Rollins." Nolan stood. The church seemed to hold its breath. Pauline felt the old fear rise, not of Nolan but for him. One blow would ruin the truth. One flash of his father's temper, and Mercy Creek would remember only violence. Nolan removed his hat slowly. "I am careful," he said. "More careful than you deserve." Asa's hand twitched near his belt, but he was no gunman. He was a man used to corners where women stood alone. In a church full of witnesses, with Nolan Rollins watching him, he looked suddenly smaller. Then Eliza stood. She was shaking. "Silas," she whispered. "Tell it, tell it." He turned on her. "Sit down." Eliza flinched, and Pauline saw her whole life in that flinch. Nolan saw it too. But Pauline moved first. She walked down the aisle to her sister and held out her hand. Eliza stared at it as if it were a bridge over a river she had never dared cross. "Tell it," Pauline said gently. "Not for me. For yourself." Eliza's face crumpled. Silas signed her name. Asa said the debt would disappear if Pauline married him. I knew. I let her be sent away. She looked at Pauline through tears. I was afraid he would turn me out next. The church erupted in whispers. Silas grabbed Eliza's wrist. Nolan was already moving, but Pauline reached them first. She took hold of Silas' fingers and peeled them from her sister's arm. "Do not," she said. Her voice was not loud. It did not need to be. Silas stared at her as if seeing someone he had never known. Perhaps he had not. Perhaps Pauline had not known herself either until that moment. Reverend Pike struck the pulpit with his palm. "Enough." The sheriff, who had been sitting near the back, came forward. He was an older man with tired eyes and no taste for church theater, but he knew fraud when it stood sweating in front of him. Silas began to protest. Asa denied everything. Mort tried to explain the ledger. Reverend Pike called for order. Children craned their necks. Women whispered over handkerchiefs. Through it all, Nolan stood in the aisle, not touching Pauline, not speaking over her. Just there, when the sheriff asked Pauline whether she wished to make a formal complaint, the church went quiet again. Pauline looked at Eliza, who was crying into Mrs. Keene's shoulder. She looked at Silas, furious and trapped. She looked at Asa, who already seemed to be calculating his next town. Then she looked at Nolan. He gave no instruction, no nod, no claim. The choice was hers. "Yes," Pauline said. "I do." That one word cost her the last scraps of being agreeable. It cost her the old habit of keeping peace for people who called her Christian, only when she suffered quietly. It cost her the safety of being small. But when she said it, she stood taller. Outside the church, after the sheriff took Silas to his office and Asa rode away under the eyes of men who had laughed too easily, Pauline found herself in the yard with sunlight on her face. Nolan approached, holding his hat in both hands. "You did brave," he said. "I nearly fainted. Brave often looks like that." She laughed, then cried, then tried to stop both. He offered his handkerchief. This time, accepting did not feel like begging. It took Mercy Creek less time to change its story than Pauline expected, and longer to change its heart. By Tuesday, people who had called her foolish were saying they had always wondered about Silas Bell. By Thursday, Mort Keene adjusted the ledger and claimed poor eyesight. By the next Sunday, Reverend Pike apologized from the pulpit for letting rumor stand where truth should have been sought. Pauline accepted the apology. She did not offer the town her trust so quickly. Eliza moved with her children into a small room behind Mrs. Keene's store until arrangements could be made. Silas faced charges for fraud and assault, though no one knew what punishment would come. Asa Voss left Mercy Creek before anyone could ask why a merciful man ran so fast. When Mercy required testimony at the Rollins Ranch, work did not stop for justice. Cows still needed hay. Chickens still scattered where they pleased. Ruth still lost hair ribbons, and Toby still believed washing behind his ears was a burden placed upon boys after the fall of Adam. Pauline kept cooking. That was what surprised her most. After the church, after the public shame had turned toward the people who deserved it, after she had spoken and been believed, the world did not become grand. No orchestra swell, no golden door open. There was bread to bake. There were beans to soak. There was ash to sweep from the hearth and water to carry, and a loose shutter to fix before the next wind. But the work felt different. Not lighter, exactly. Chosen. One evening in early autumn, Nolan came in late from the far pasture. The sunset followed him, red along the edges of his coat. Pauline was kneading dough at the table while Ruth shelled peas and Toby practiced sums with his tongue caught between his teeth. Nolan washed, then stood awkwardly near the stove. Pauline noticed. "You are blocking the heat like a man, with news." Toby looked up. "Is it bad news?" "No," Nolan said. "Just news." Ruth dropped a pea. "Are we leaving?" The fear in her voice cut the room. Nolan crouched beside her. "No, honey. You're not leaving unless you want to. Widow Hale is better, but she says you and Toby can stay through winter. After that, we'll decide proper, with you listened to." Ruth threw her arms around his neck. Nolan held her carefully at first, then fully. Pauline turned back to the dough so he could have the moment unseen. But he spoke her name. "Pauline." She looked over her shoulder. "I rode to Judge Calloway." Her hands stilled in flour. "He says I can petition for guardianship if the children want it, and Widow Hale agrees." Clara's people back east never answered. "These two need a home that won't pass them around like borrowed tools." Toby set his pencil down. "Could we stay here?" Nolan looked at him. "I'd like that, with Miss Pauline." The room changed. Ruth looked between the adults, suddenly alert in the way children were when they sensed grown hearts walking near deep water. Pauline wiped her hands on her apron. "Toby, that is not for you to settle." "I know," he said, "but supper's better with you." Nolan stood slowly. His eyes stayed on Pauline. "I went to the judge about the children," he said. "I went to Reverend Pike about something else." Her heart began to pound. Ruth whispered. "Oh," Toby whispered back. "What?" Nolan took a step closer, but stopped with the table still between them, always giving her space, always leaving room for her answer. "I don't want to make you a bargain," he said. "I don't want you staying because you need shelter, or because the town left you no road, or because children love your biscuits." "They do love my biscuits," Ruth said softly. Nolan almost smiled, but the feeling in his face was too serious to make light. "I want to court you, Pauline Douglas, properly, if you'll allow it. And if, after time, you find this house gentle enough, I would be honored to ask you to make it a home with me." The dough sagged between Pauline's fingers. No one had ever offered her time. Silas had offered obligation. Asa had offered ownership. Mercy Creek had offered judgment. Even kindness from some people had come with a hidden hook. Nolan offered time. Time to decide. Time to be more than useful. Time to learn whether gentleness could last beyond gratitude. She looked around the room. The curtains made from feed sacks glowed in lamplight. The recipe book lay on the shelf with flour dust in its crease. Toby's letters covered a slate. Ruth's peas sat in a crooked pile. Nolan stood with his scarred hands open, fear plain in his eyes and courage holding him still. "I do not know how to be courted," Pauline said. "Good," Nolan replied. "I don't know how to court." A laugh broke from her, wet and surprised. The children giggled because permission had entered the room like sunlight. Pauline pressed her palms together, flour and all. "Then we will have to learn slow." Nolan nodded. "Slow is fine," and they did. Courtship at the Rollins Ranch did not look like poems or buggy rides every Saturday, though Nolan did take her once to a meadow full of late wildflowers, and looked so worried about the whole arrangement that Pauline had mercy and picked the first flower herself. It looked like Nolan building shelves in the pantry, because Pauline had said cans should not sit on the floor. It looked like Pauline teaching him to read from his mother's recipe book, one word at a time, until he could make out cinnamon, molasses, and mercy, though mercy was not in any recipe, and somehow belonged there anyway. It looked like the two of them sitting on the porch, after the children slept, talking in pieces about what had hurt them, and what still frightened them. Some nights Nolan said nothing more than, "My father shouted from that step," and Pauline would answer, "Then we will not shout from it." Some nights Pauline said, "I wake thinking I must earn breakfast," and Nolan would answer, "Breakfast is not a test." By winter, Mercy Creek had stopped whispering when Pauline entered the store. Mrs. Keene set aside good yeast for her. Reverend Pike, asked if she would help organize the Christmas supper. Pauline said yes, but only if Eliza helped too. Eliza was learning courage in smaller steps. She apologized more than Pauline needed, and some days Pauline had to tell her, gently, that guilt was not the same as repair. But the sisters began again with mending between them, slow and imperfect. On the first snow of December, Nolan drove Pauline to town in the wagon. The children rode under Quilson back, arguing cheerfully over whether snow tasted better from mittens or fence rails. At the church, Judge Calloway signed the guardianship papers. Toby tried to stand solemn and failed. Ruth cried, then laughed, then asked if this meant Uncle Nolan could not return her for store credit. No returns, Nolan said, his voice rough. Afterward, while the town gathered for the Christmas supper, Reverend Pike cleared his throat. There is another matter, if Miss Douglas permits. Pauline turned. Nolan stood beside the long table where women were setting pies, beans, roasted chicken, and loaves of bread. He wore his black hat in his hands. His hair was combed badly. His collar sat crooked. Ruth had clearly tried to fix it and failed. People began to smile, but kindly this time. Nolan walked to Pauline, in front of the whole church hall, not to rescue her from shame, not to defend her from lies, just to stand with her where everyone could see. I asked to court you slow, he said. You did. I tried. You did. I burned coffee. Only twice since 3 times. Toby called 4. If you count the hunting trip. Laughter filled the hall. Nolan waited until it settled. His eyes never left Pauline's. This town first saw you hungry and thought that meant you were worth less. I first saw you wet, bruised, holding my lost skillet, warning me you could make dinner if the Lord let you stay. His voice thickened. Pauline Douglas, the Lord used you to make that house a place I am not afraid to enter. But I do not ask you to stay as cook or shelter seeker or woman rescued from rain. I ask you to stay as my wife, if your heart can rest with mine. The hall went silent. Pauline felt the eyes, but they no longer owned her. She looked at Nolan and saw the man who had opened a door because she knocked. The man who paid wages instead of charity. The man who had risked his temper by holding it. Risked his name by standing beside hers, risked his heart by offering it without demand. She thought of all the tables where she had eaten last, all the rooms where she had listened for anger, all the mornings she had believed survival was the closest thing to home she would ever know. Then she smiled. My heart can rest with yours, she said, and it can work beside it too. Ruth burst into tears. Toby whooped. Mrs. Keene clapped both hands over her mouth. Reverend Pike looked heavenward as if relieved that Joy had finally managed to behave decently in his church. Nolan took Pauline's hand. He did not kiss her there, though half the town leaned forward, hoping he might. He simply held her hand like something entrusted, not taken. They married in January, on a cold morning bright with frost. Pauline wore the blue calico, remade with lace from Mrs. Keene and a ribbon from Ruth. Nolan wore a black coat brushed clean until it almost looked new. Toby carried the rings and nearly dropped them. Eliza stood with Pauline and wept quietly, not from guilt this time, but from gratitude that some doors, once closed in cruelty, did not get the final word. After the vows, they returned to the Rollins Ranch, not to a grand feast, not to silver or crystal, to dinner. Pauline insisted on cooking, though Nolan protested until she put a spoon in his hand and told him marriage did not free him from onions. Together, they made his mother's molasses biscuits, beans with salt pork, fried potatoes, and a dried apple pie. Ruth had helped roll too thin in the middle. When the meal was ready, Pauline stood in the kitchen doorway. The room was no longer bare. Curtains warmed the windows. Shelves held jars of peaches, beans, flour, and coffee. The children's slates leaned near the hearth. Nolan's mother's recipe book sat open, dusted with flour, alive again. A fire burned steady. Outside, snow gathered gently along the porch rail. Nolan looked at Pauline from the head of the table. though he had refused to sit until she sat too. Toby and Ruth folded their hands waiting. Pauline touched the skillet handle, the same skillet she had carried through rain, the one that had given her a reason to knock when pride and hunger had nearly driven her past the last house. Her eyes met Nolan's. "I made dinner," she said softly. Nolan stood across the kitchen and took her flour-dusted hand. "And the Lord let you stay." She leaned into him then, not because she had nowhere else to stand, but because she had chosen this place, this man, these children, this table. Outside, Mercy Creek lay quiet beneath winter. Inside, in a house once ruled by fear and then by silence, a family bowed over warm food. The skillet rested at the center of the table, black iron shining in firelight, no longer lost, no longer empty, and no longer a warning. It was home,